If you go back to episode 76 of the Bellingham Podcast, today's voice is going to sound really familiar. I used to call him Dan in Cyprus. Now he's Dan in the UK, but he goes by the handle at DanC21CY on Instagram, a watch enthusiast in the British military and a friend of ours in the watchfam. You've tuned into the Bellingham Podcast miniseries, The Watchfam, brought to you by The Analog Explorer. Read about my analog manifesto through my photography and my passions of travel and watches, in print or now as a digital magazine at theanalogexplorer.com. Now, Dan's specialty in his collection happens to be general service watches issued to the British Army, and you'll find out what that means in a bit. But it's not all just form follows function with Dan when it comes to watches. You're going to also hear more of his romantic side when it comes to watches and the legacy that we have with these timepieces. And also, you should probably know that Dan and I have probably talked for, 2 years online. I say talk, really it's just DMing on Instagram and sharing our wrist shots that we take from around the world. But this is the first time that Dan and I ever actually talked. And it was great. It's like sitting down with an old friend, even though I've never met him and never talked to him voice to voice. And that's what's really cool about the Watch Fam, is you'll get a sense of how open we are all about talking about not just our watches, but the stories around them. Because as the cliche would go, put up a fresh hot pot of tea, and hopefully you can enjoy this episode as we find out from Dan's perspective. Why watches? So Dan, welcome to the show.
Hi, G. Thanks for letting me come on the show, man. It's really cool to finally partake in your podcast and not just be an avid listener every week. So that's quite cool.
In light of this episode, I have a special tea that I brewed because I figured if I was talking to somebody in the United Kingdom, I might as well be brewing a good cup of tea. I've got a vintage Earl Grey before me as we chat.
Ooh, you're teasing me. Now, are you having it with milk or lemon?
No, I don't do it with milk or lemon. I just like it straight up because the loose leaf tea that I have is from a local shop here, and it's just really good, really clean, really crisp, as long as you don't steep it too long. So I know you've got to be drinking tea. What are you drinking?
I am drinking tea because of the time difference currently, obviously, as you know. It's a little bit later here in the day. I'm actually on mint tea at the moment,
nice.
Just to enjoy my chilled out weekend and my evening before I go back to work tomorrow. So I've decided to cut the caffeine now and just enjoy a few glasses of mint tea.
So more importantly, what's on your wrist?
So on my wrist, you'll like it. It's obviously been mentioned before in your previous episodes, but I'm actually wearing my Bremont Solo, which I obviously headed up with Bremont themselves through the military and special projects team.
So to kick off the series, I have one question that I always kind of start off with everybody, and that is, from one watch aficionado to another, why watches?
So I've got two main points for that then. One, it's practical, and then two, I guess it's the emotional investment into an item which you carry with you every day. So they're the two main reasons why I went down the watch collecting route.
Outside of just the practical and emotional sense, I know that as a collector, you kind of have a unique collection that you scavenged across, I guess, much of the world. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about your special Seiko or I guess your service-oriented watches collection that you are able to put together?
We'll talk about the practical element, right? So I joined the military when I was 19 years old. And the first thing you get told when you join the military is you need a watch, okay? You need to be able to tell the time. You need to be at a place with whatever you need for a certain time, and the military obviously, runs everything by timing and being punctual. So it's that practical element that, kind of made me look into this collecting hobby. When I joined the army, I found out that the British military used to issue watches to soldiers. Now, for me, that was quite interesting because I also, outside of collecting watches, I'm actually a bit of a history geek. I like reading up about military history and history in general. And I also like collecting old things. So when I found out that these watches used to be issued, it kind of like ticked something in my brain where I thought, oh, that'd be really cool to, try and find out if I can basically collect one of every single type. And that's kind of where I started. I started with British military watches, and I decided to do some research, as we all did. And I actually got inundated with the extensive amount of watches that have been issued to the British military since basically the Second World War. So I had to narrow down what I wanted to collect. And I decided that I was going to only collect watches that were issued to the British Army, because they had a certain issue code on them. That issue code, as we know, or people would have heard of, is the W10 reference that is on the back of every wristwatch issued to the British Army. And I decided only to collect general service watches. The reason I limited it is because if I started collecting into divers or specialist trade watches, I would be throwing down a lot of money into this hobby at a very young age at the time, because like I said, I was only 19, early 20 when I first started this hobby. My collection, I'm quite pleased to say that I'm very fortunate, and I have managed to collect, bar one type at the moment, because I haven't found an example that I'm willing to pay for at the moment, one of pretty much every kind of general service issue watch to the British military since the Second World War.
I mean, outside of being just a collector, you had a special project with Bremont to get the watch that's on your wrist today. Do you have any other current projects that you're working with?
Yeah, so I've had an involvement with a project. So I was a client and supporter of this project. There's a new watch which has come into creation, as it were, by a company called Elliot Brown. Okay, so Elliot Brown are a British watch company. They're actually based down in Dorset. They actually recently secured a contract with the Ministry of Defence to supply a particular unit of the British military with new divers watches, or what I guess you would consider mission timers. Through that contract to the military, they became the first British company to supply an issued watch to the British military in over a decade. And obviously, they can be demanded by a unit and an individual if their role and requirement fit, to have that watch.
So how does that work being in service? Like, not every serviceman or woman can go in and just request a watch. It has to be mission specific or mission granted, I guess.
Yeah, there's mission specific trades and positions which traditionally would allow them to have an issued watch. Now, obviously, the reason issued watches came about in the first place was because obviously back in the day, watches were expensive, right?
Right.
Mechanical watches are definitely expensive. And the volume of soldiers in conflict obviously always increased. And also pay of soldiers back in the day wasn't as much as it is now.
Sure.
So they couldn't always afford a watch. That's why watches were issued. There's a lesser requirement for watches to be issued now. So they do kind of limit it to specific roles. Those roles traditionally being stuff such as aviation, if you're pilots, if you're aircrew, divers, but also if you're of a certain rank or a certain position within a unit, you can also have an issued watch, because with rights and responsibilities of the individual, you also get to reap the benefit of it, that kind of stuff. So traditionally, it would be NCOs within a certain appointment. And then obviously traditionally, back in the Second World War, these watches, funny enough, were actually more for the privates because they couldn't afford them.
That makes sense.
I've got a story for you, which comes all the way over from Cyprus, actually. There's a gentleman over in Cyprus who's retired British Army. He served as a career soldier all of his life. And when he was the regimental sergeant major of his battalion, he actually used to take the issued watches off certain people because he knew that those individuals basically could afford to buy their own watch. So he would take the issued watches off them because he was the regimental sergeant major and nobody would tell him no. He would give the issued watches to the privates who couldn't afford a watch, and then tell the individual who he took the watch off to go and buy their own. So it's quite funny how it's now a role reversal, where now you almost have to be in a position of speciality, or like a specialist role, or of a certain rank to have a watch. So it's quite funny how it's reversed now.
But I mean, regardless of the role, like in the case of like Elliot Brown, like these watches are being made still specifically as a tool, right? Like this is still being field tested, field abused, field used, right?
Yes, yeah. So these watches, you use this in the field, you use this, in work, and actually, when you leave the unit, you are required to return it because, like I said, it's only issued to you. It's like your uniform is issued to you. You technically give it back. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that they will all be given back because things happen, as we know. And
so when, like in the cases that sometimes these watches don't get returned, like, because I mean, anybody in the watch fam has surfed through the flea bay to try to find like the Dirty Dozen watches or
of course,
yeah, the watches that were in service and stuff. How is it that some service personnel are able to keep the watch and then later it gets sold or it gets inherited and stuff if it is military property?
Well, there's two things that can happen. The most common is the individual claims that they've lost it and they will get charged for it.
Okay.
So they will get charged they get charged for, in theory, get charged the monetary value of which that item costs. You know, it basically, because they've said, well, you've lost military equipment, you're paying for it. You know, it's obviously through a defense contract, so they don't pay what you would consider full retail for it. They pay the amount of money that the government or the military buy that individual item for. Okay?
Sure.
That is not representative on the prices that some collectors will pay on eBay. I'm just saying,
right?
Which is quite funny. That's the most common reason why these things end up on eBay. And then the other reason is there's a thing which the British military call it anyway. I don't know what the equivalent would be in America, but it's called war stock. So sometimes there's an influx of kit and equipment which is predominantly going to be used in conflict. So if it's going to go to a conflict zone or a war zone, it's classed as war stock. And what happens is, even though it's issued to that individual, because that person's going to a environment which is less permissive, that is more, violent and all that kind of stuff, they will effectively factor in the likelihood that piece of equipment won't come back. So there's a way officially that if it counts as war stock, you technically don't have to give it back because the military weren't expecting it to come back from that theatre of conflict.
Also with the military contracts, like the watches and I guess any equipment really that's built for any military, they have to abide by a certain specification, obviously, but also I mean some parts of the military are able to kind of dictate the aesthetic, right? Like we see certain pieces that are made for military, that those dials, those hands or whatever, that configuration. Is there a reasoning behind that? I mean, is there somebody behind some desk somewhere? It's like, the British Army needs sword hands, or is it just done out of utility?
I know that every single piece of British military equipment has a specification that it had to adhere to. All of that kind of stuff is more born out of a utilitarian practice rather than, they specified whatever, the way to look. That being said, I know that in terms of the Elliot Brown project, this was done slightly differently. So with the Elliot Brown project, the unit of the British military actually already had exposure to Elliot Brown. And because of where they're headquartered and where this unit is headquartered, they cross paths a lot. So actually a lot of the members of this unit had bought civilian Elliot Brown watches.
Oh, okay.
So when they decided, or when the need arose for this unit to have new issue diving watches, because of the unit's budget and their flexibility with who they can approach for equipment, they went to who they knew. They went to Elliot Brown. And the design for these Holton divers watches, because that's what they're called, was almost a two-way conversation between the unit and the company themselves. Yes, the unit, said we want the watch to be, robust. We want it to have loom. We want it to be water resistant, all that kind of stuff. But then what was quite interesting is the fact that when I met Ian Elliot and Alex Brown, who obviously run the company, they said that they had a two-way engagement with the unit. They got members of the unit to bring their own Elliot Brown watches in to the meeting and said, right, you've already bought our watches of various, models. What do you like and what don't you like? And we'll incorporate what you like and we'll take away what you don't. That's quite unique, really. Whereas previously, if you look at the CWC G10 watches and W10 watches,
right,
that would have just been MOD specification order where they've gone, right, we want the watch to be accurate within this amount of time. We want it to have a power reserve of roughly this time. We want it to be luminous, and we want it to, be of this size. Send this specification out to various companies. When the companies bring back the prototypes, we'll pick one. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's not a two-way conversation. Whereas with Elliot Brown, it was a two-way conversation. It was, well, actually, we need this, this, and this. Actually,
they got direct feedback from the people that would be using them practically, as opposed to, the big government agency saying like, hey, here is just like any other government, whether it's the United States or UK, like, here's the spec sheet, check all the boxes. If you get all the boxes, you get the contract. Like,
exactly. And also, not only if you tick all the boxes, do you get the contract? It's also, if you tick all the boxes and you meet our price requirements, you get the contract, because unfortunately, in my experience, certain pieces of equipment to the British military are colloquially known to have gone to the cheapest bidder, and that kind of stuff, because also the MOD want to save money, because issuing uniform or kit and equipment on large volumes costs money. Defense contracts cost money. And a good example of that is, we hinted earlier at the Vietnam Seikos that I heard. The Vietnam Seikos, again, the units, or the Maccabee SOG unit, which was obviously the special forces in Vietnam, they obviously had a bigger budget than the larger frontline units that you would think of in the Vietnam War, so they could almost demand whatever they wanted. When they demanded watches, funny enough, the operators in that unit, they demanded Rolex watches because they knew that they could get the most expensive pieces of equipment because the government were willing to buy it. That obviously didn't happen because defense contractor, he did almost what Elliot Brown did, was he went out and met the soldiers and he met the operators in the units and said, look, I see that you've asked for Rolex watches, but actually Rolex watches at the time cost up to $120 each. But I see on your wrist that you've gone down to the local PX and you've bought an $8 Seiko. Why have you bought that $8 Seiko? And the soldiers were like, well, they work, they're luminous, they've got this, they've got that, and all these reasons. And they went, right, I'll go to Seiko then, because they'll make me exactly what you want for less money. You know what I mean? So it's also down to the costings of a contract as well. So that's another reason why these divers watches, the Elliot Browns, are more limited and I guess sought after, because not many will have them issued.
So let's talk about the current project. So, I presume you do have one. I
do. I went and collected mine just before Christmas. It was a Christmas present to myself. it was a good Christmas. But the project itself, okay, so is the Elliot Brown Holton 354. Okay, so 354 takes into account, I believe, the anniversary of the Royal Marines, which the project basically commemorates them as a unit / the Royal Navy. Ties in with the Holton. The name Holton comes from the Royal Navy ammunition factory based on the South Coast during the Second World War. Only 60 of these watches were made, and they are slightly different to the issued iteration of the Holton watch to the British forces. So these ones come in different dial colorations. So I've got a subdued grey.
Subdued grey. So that's Bellingham approved right there. Nice.
There you go. And then you can also have bought a dark blue dial. So they're the two main things which differ the 354 Holtons to the issued Holtons, because obviously the issued ones have a black dial. The other thing that is different is that this has a sterile dial, so it actually only has the Elliot Brown shield on it. So it doesn't actually say Elliot Brown. And it also has a different handset in that the minute hand is orange. So it's outlined in orange. And that's almost a throwback to the 1960s divers.
Right. Like the old Squalas and
yes.
The Plowproffs, I think, had that type of hand set up.
Exactly. Very much that. But they kept the sword hands, so it's still got sword hands, but it just has an orange minute hand, just to differentiate it and make it a little bit more different. And as far as I'm aware, it's the only Elliot Brown project to date which has an orange minute hand. And the other thing that that differentiates it in terms of complication is that this doesn't have a date window, purely to keep the symmetry of the dial. So on the Elliot Brown Holtons with the black dials and the issued ones, they obviously have a date complication, and the date is roughly at the 430 position.
Oh, okay.
They removed it for this project just to keep the dial symmetry. But it also has a fully loomed diving bezel, which is fully graticled, or whatever you'd class it as, 0 through to 60.
Is it bidirectional or is it unidirectional like a traditional diver?
Unidirectional, like a traditional diver. And then also on the rehort, between obviously the dial and the crystal, it's got 24-hour time.
Nice.
Yeah.
So again,
it's an absolutely lovely watch. It's amazing.
Yeah, and again, getting back to what military service really needs: legibility and functionality.
Yeah, exactly that. So everything about this is almost where form follows function throughout the whole project. So, for example, the case has also got a special kind of coating which basically repels dirt, grime, all of that kind of stuff.
Blood,
potentially, yes. The spring, the lugs and the spring bars aren't spring bars; they're actually screw-in bars. So you could basically hang off this if you really wanted to, and it's not going to go anywhere. I think you're more likely to lose your arm before the watch came off your wrist. So,
there you go. You should send that into Elliot Brown as their slogan for this run. You might lose your arm, but you won't lose your watch.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about kind of the form and the functional aspect, but at the same time, it's a very nice watch to look at. It's still a very classical design, and they've put a lot of thought into how they make the watch. So it's really nice. Kind
of looping around a little bit. So with Elliot Brown being a British company, obviously, and servicing British military here in the United States, we're in this big boom in the watch fam. I'm sure you're tuned into it, where we have a ton of micro brands and also this kind of sub community of accessory builders. There are people that just kind of start in their garage creating stuff, whether for creating a watch or stuff for watches. Are you seeing something similar over in the UK?
There's definitely been a boom in the last couple of years where you've got micro brands popping up, or British watches kind of becoming, coming more to the public eye, more to the forefront, I guess, to the what I would class as the average or the more general watch collector. I say that like watch collecting is like a massive hobby and that's normal. It's obviously a very niche hobby still, but I find that military watches are even more niche within that. Right. But yeah, from my experience, there's a lot of guys, or I say a lot of guys, there's prominent individuals who make watch accessories within Britain. And I'm quite fortunate as well to own some of these accessories. But the most recent individual who I've come into contact with is Darren. He runs a company called Zulu Alpha Watch Straps, and he is ex-Royal Navy, and he actually makes straps from recycled rifle slings, which again, for me, ties in the military element, which I find really cool, and also it's recycling stuff, I think that's quite important too, it's trying to change the mindset of individuals to, find a second use for things, not throw everything away, invest into something that you can either use for multiple things or find a new use for it. So I like that as well.
That kind of falls into just watches and horology in general. I mean, typically speaking, watches were meant to be bought once and last several generations. I mean, that's why they're serviceable and such. And straps and the other accessories kind of go by the wayside because they're kind of the tires on the vehicle, right? You change tires every so often. So with Zulu Alpha straps, they're using rifle slings. For people that are not in the military, what is that and how is that being adapted to a watch strap?
So a rifle sling is obviously that material which traditionally loops through 2 points either end of a rifle, which enables a soldier to carry that weapon system without it always being in his hand. Darren managed to, again, it was born out of practicality because he bought a nice watch where he was afraid that this stock strap that it came on potentially could break through his lifestyle. So he went searching for other alternatives. In his experience through that search, he didn't find anything that would suit his needs. And when he was clearing out his shed, of all things, he came across a couple of old SA-80, which is the British Army issued rifle, SA-80 rifle slings. And it just so happened that the width of the nylon matched with the lug width of his watch. And he decided, well, it's good nylon. It's only going to go in the bin. I may as well have a go at making a strap out of it. And he came up with a system to secure it, which is, in my experience, unique to the watch straps out there. He uses a tri-glide buckle system. So the watch strap doesn't have a pin and buckle as a traditional like NATO strap would have. It has this tri-glide buckle system, which works purely on friction, but is also very secure. And the good thing about it is that you can basically have any size you want on it, because obviously it's a buckle, that almost free slides up and down the nylon. You're not conforming to, oh, I have to have it this tight on my wrist because that's where the pinhole is for the pin, to go through. Or if I want it tighter, I'm going to have to burn a hole through my strap to make a new, hole. So you'll always get a comfortable fit, which is quite good as well. It is literally just Darren making them himself. There's cool. A very honest aura or air about the straps that he makes. You can tell that they're handmade. You can have, they're all made by him. Each one's made by him in his home. And also for him, it's a big thing he wanted to do was, like I said, get away from outsourcing to other countries. He wanted something to be British. He prides himself on being a independent strap maker, and the fact that he's using upcycled materials, within Britain to do that. He basically wanted to go against the grain of, effectively Amazon and eBay.
And that whole story of that reminds me a lot of like the original Tudor snowflake for the Marine Nationale, right? The nage, what is it? Nage de combat. The elastic straps that people see on the Tudor submariners. Yeah, exactly that. It's a strap that was born out of a practical or a practical necessity, really, and the individuals who made those straps originally used the materials that they had to hand, which is really interesting. And actually, did you know the reason why the French Navy divers had to make their own straps? Wasn't it because they were delivered just head end? They didn't have straps issued to them?
Exactly that. Yeah. Which obviously then rolls back into the fact that all government contracts are bought on a budget, because obviously buying a Tudor submariner is X amount of money, but buying a Tudor submariner on its bracelet is even more. So obviously what did the French government do? Well, we'll just get rid of the bracelet.
Kind of wraps around into the holistic story of hey, here is somebody who built a tool for something that, he didn't want to lose. And I don't blame him. If I had a Rolex Submariner, to which I don't, I would not want it to fall off my wrist as I'm riding on my motorcycle. I mean, that's why I usually gravitate towards the strap manufacturers I do, is because, it pains me. It pains me to see somebody buy their first nice watch, quote unquote, right? Whatever that is, whether it's a Miyota Movement or a Rolex, whatever that person sees as their first nice watch. And then they go to eBay and buy the $2 NATO strap. And I'm like, oh man, that's not good.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with you. Supporting an individual to do something that, like you said, they're passionate about is really important. And like you said also, the practical elements of recycling something or upcycling something, because we may as well use it. Because like I said, it's unfortunately only going to end up in landfill, and that's obviously not really what we want to do. So.
No.
But it's funny, isn't it? How, like you said, people will go and buy a $2 strap for a really nice watch.
Yeah.
And you sit there and kind of go, that's, I mean, I cringe a little bit, because you sit there and kind of go, I'd be really upset if that came off, Right. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a Rolex, it can be anything. All watches and I had this discussion before we came on the on this podcast, is I feel that all watches have a certain emotional investment into, like I said, that's a item that is with you as an individual every single day of your life, or however long that period is before you either buy a new watch or you have to replace the watch. You can get emotionally invested into it, so it will be heartbreaking if that thing comes off your wrist when you're riding your motorbike.
And that's kind of how I wanted to end this episode. Is we kind of hit on a lot of the practicality and the service aspect of watches. And in your opinion, in today's day and age, do you feel like in the future, do you feel like our future generations are going to have the same emotional attachment to a small trinket like a watch?
So I think as long as there are basically weirdos like ourselves who appreciate mechanical watches, I don't think, I think that individuals, not on a mass scale, but I think people will still appreciate a mechanical trinket, like you said, a mechanical watch, traditional watchmaking.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is like you said, it's such a unique hobby. I think it's still gaining traction, isn't it? And it has been the dawn of all the watch forums. It's still growing. And apparently, I don't know how true this is, but I was told when I went into a boutique a couple of weeks ago that actually their sales in the last year have only gone up because of the reason that younger people, people of my generation, mid-20s, want to escape being connected to something. The point to them is that they want to escape the idea that something on their wrist is going to give them a notification. So they go and buy a Seiko, they go and buy a Casio, they go and buy something that is just an entity in itself.
Yeah.
And I'm hope that as individuals continue to do that yes, they will become emotionally invested. I mean, I look at my watch collection, AJ, and every single watch, I've got an emotional connection to it, be it my father's watch, my Amiga, that he gifted to me when I was 23 for my birthday, or to my Bremont, which I designed for my trade within the military, through to my first CWC. They all have memories accredited to them, and I just hope that when it gets to that point where I kind of shuffle off my mortal coil and these watches get handed down, that those family members look at these watches and these, like I said, mechanical trinkets, whether they're, even though they're, like you said, technologically outdated, that they see it as an emotional investment of me into those items.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
The only watch that in my collection that I really don't have any current emotional investment in it is actually my Explorer, because I bought it brand new. But the way I look at that is that watch will travel with me and gain new memories. All of my military watches have stories before I own them. The Rolex doesn't. So I hope that when it comes to handing that down, that, say, my son or my daughter will look at that and say, that was Dad's watch, the way that I look at my father's Amiga.
I think anybody in the watch fam, like the thing that makes us all kind of tick is that we always have that one watch or that one story that led us to that, to coming into watches, honestly, because that's why I started off the show with why watches, because that's the one question that as a watch person, we all get every time. Yeah. And it's funny because talking to another watch aficionado for however long we've been on this call, it's a sit down and long story. And it's funny because in today's day and age, I find that when somebody who's a non-watch person asks that question, they're just like, oh yeah, well, why watches, And it's funny because they don't really get the idea behind what we've kind of described as it's emotional. It is something of legacy, an heirloom. This concept of an heirloom is being lost.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to hear your story with regards to not just you personally, but also seeking out the vintage of watches that you found because of your heritage and your family's heritage to British military.
Yeah. No, that was a big thing, like you said, it's the idea of, it's a romantic element to it, isn't it? I think with watches, there's a romantic element. Totally. There's a story element to these trinkets, to these devices, because fundamentally, like you said, all they do is tell time, but it's that emotional link that I've put to that, in that, that item more than anything. And it's romantic. You know, I think there's a romantic element as well of the idea of a watchmaker sitting there and making it. You know, I think modern society is so wound, like I said, everything's fast paced, isn't it? You know, you can turn your phone on, you can get a notification, you know what's happened, you know, halfway around the world within minutes of it happening. Society is so used to things being immediate and quick and disposable that they forget actually having something that isn't immediate, that isn't quick in terms of production, in terms of the time and effort put into it, you know, and the fact that it can be handed down. They don't understand it because they've been brought up in an era where everything's disposable, because it's quicker, cheaper and easier to buy a replacement on Amazon. I think it's sad, personally, but that's just me.
That wraps up this special edition of the Bellingham Podcast. Thank you again so much for listening to us, rating us, reviewing us, wherever you like to get your podcast. Remember, if you're in the Bellingham area, you might be listening to us on KMRE 102.3 FM, Low Power, community radio here in the heart of the city by the Salish Sea. And also remember that this mini-series is brought to you by The Analog Explorer. Find out more about my analog manifesto through my photography, my love of travel, and of course, my tick for watches. You can read about it in a digital magazine or in print at theanalogexplorer.com. Thank you again so much for tuning in. I'm AJ Barse, and we will see you next week.